One of the most common questions I get from writers is my work ready to query? And it's a really good question because when you send your work out to agents, you want it to feel like your very best work, your most polished work. You want to make the best first impression so hopefully you can get an offer. Well, I think there are 5 sort of secret signs that you're really ready to query. One sign that your story is ready to share with agents is that you can describe how your main character changes from the beginning of the story to the end of the story, and specifically how the events in the story inspire that change. Now, this might seem kind of obvious, but in fact, when you sit down to write out these changes, you might find that they're sort of difficult to describe, or the changes feel very general and generic. So for instance, if you find yourself saying, well, my main character just kind of gets braver or more confident, that might not be enough of a character arc to support your story. A better example might go something like this. Let's say you've written a story about a girl who learns to become a champion swimmer. Well, you should be able to point to chapters in the early part of the book where she's not a champion swimmer and her skills aren't developed yet. You should be able to point to scenes at the end of the book where it's clearly demonstrated that she is a great swimmer and has conquered her fear of the sea. And you should be able to show specific scenes within the middle of the book, and this is the really important part, that show her changing, that show moments that she overcomes her fear, that show moments where her skills increase despite adversity. These are the scenes that actually make up the plot of your story. They're your character's changing moments. So if you're able to do this, if you can describe that character arc, that means your story is probably pretty solid and possibly ready to submit. Another sign that you're ready to query, you rewrote your opening after writing your ending. Openings are so important, and they're such a fabulous opportunity to create an amazing first impression. I could talk about my favorite first lines for hours. But the best openings incorporate the themes of the story. Sometimes they foreshadow elements of the plot. Great writers use their opening sentences, paragraphs, and chapters to give us a picture of the world that we're about to enter. And the only way you can know that stuff is if you've already written the whole story. So if you have gone back and reworked your opening so it's as punchy, exciting, and evocative of your book as it can be, you might be ready to query. Another sign that you're ready to query is that you know what makes your story special and you've got your comp titles to prove it. Now, comp titles are 2 other books that you compare in your query letter in order to give an agent a better idea of what your story is about. So for instance, if you were selling the show Stranger Things, you might say it's The Goonies meets E.T. Now, comp titles don't have to be other books, but if you're pitching a book, it's good to use at least one book as one comp, and then say a television show, a pop culture reference, even a different genre as your other comp title. Here's an example. The Lion King is Hamlet with animals. Boom. Now, if you can't come up with comp titles for your work, that might actually be sort of a bad sign, and here's why. 1, it might mean that you don't know your market very well. You should be reading a lot of different books in the genre that you want to write, and if you've only read 1 or 2 that don't really apply to your work, that means that you aren't fully steeped in the style that you're trying to write in. 2, it might mean that your work is too similar to too many other books. If you're having a hard time finding 2 comps that feel different from one another, it might mean that your book is too similar to everything else. It's just Lord of the Rings-ish fantasy meets Lord of the Rings-ish fantasy. That's not good. But when you do find comp titles that are recent, it shows your knowledge of the market, and it shows that you know what makes your story special. And if your story is special, then it's definitely ready to submit. Another way to tell that you're ready to query is that you can summarize your story well, completely, and it makes sense. Now, there have been times I thought I could do this for manuscripts that I'd written. Sure, I can summarize my own story, I just spent all this time writing it. But when I sat down to actually try and write the summary out, it was really hard, and I found that they didn't always make sense. And the reality was, that was because the stories didn't make sense. They started out with interesting characters and tension, but somewhere about 2/3 of the way through, the characters didn't know what to do. And it was because I didn't know what to do. And when I went to summarize that part of the book, I didn't know what to do again, because there wasn't enough story there. So if you can look at your manuscript and write down a simple and succinct summary that describes the events of the story from beginning to end, and all those events make sense, that's a great sign that you're ready to query. And no cheating and saying, I'm not good at writing summaries. You gotta get good at it. It's part of the job. So the fifth secret sign that you might be ready to query is perhaps the most obvious, but also the most deceptive. And it all has to do with how you incorporate feedback from others. Before you submit your work to an agent, you should absolutely be sharing it with other readers, critique partners, beta readers, just other human beings who can read your story and give you feedback. And then, of course, you want to incorporate that feedback into your work to make it the best it can be. Incorporating feedback doesn't mean taking every suggestion that every reader gives you. That's never going to work. You can't serve everyone's tastes. However, if a reader does give you a suggestion or points to a problem with your story, that does point to an issue that you need to address. So, for instance, if a beta reader tells you that the grandma scene is really boring and grandma has to go, well, maybe you don't need to cut grandma's character, but you should take a second look at that scene. Maybe the pacing is off in that scene, maybe the stakes aren't high enough for grandma, or maybe the way you've written grandma, she is just kind of boring. If you know how to incorporate feedback in a selective way to improve your story, then you're ready to query. So those are 5 secret signs that you're ready to query. And you know what? Knowing whether or not your story is working doesn't need to be a mystery. Writing isn't a magical process. It's a craft that we can learn and improve at. And if you're interested in that kind of thing, stay tuned because we're going to be posting a lot more videos like this one on this channel. And now if you're interested, here's a little bit more information about us.